Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist at American Compass, and today I am joined by a far more auspicious economist, David Autor, professor of economics at MIT. You know him probably best as researcher and author of the China Shock paper, but he's been doing an extraordinary amount of important research on labor markets before then, certainly since then, extending that work in various directions. And I'm particularly interested in a new paper that he just put out with colleagues a couple of months ago called Places versus People, the Ins and Outs of Labor Market Adjustment to Globalization. Because I think a lot of the debate on the effects of trade, of the China shock, of the decline in manufacturing, accept that of manufacturing jobs have gone away, but then come down to the question of, okay, what replaces them? Are the new jobs better or worse? Who takes the new jobs? And what Autor finds here is that, in fact, the new jobs are not as good as the manufacturing jobs that were lost, certainly in terms of wages and hours and so forth. And that in a lot of cases, it's not even the manufacturing workers who may have lost jobs who are moving into new ones at all. So I think it adds a really important depth to that story and also confronts quite helpfully some of the more happy ever after stories that try to get put on as a gloss but aren't really playing out in practice. So I learned a lot from the conversation. Hope you will as well. But before we get to it, I have to tell you, of course, about Commonplace. Great pieces coming out daily. In particular, this week had a really good piece by Nick Phillips, No Pain, No Gain on Canada and Mexico tariffs, that looks at why that trade action is necessary. And then a really nice piece by Amber Lapp called America's Missing Men that takes an inside look at America's crisis of manhood and how it's impacting her small town in Ohio. So definitely check those out. And of course, if you are not already, go subscribe to Understanding America. Talking about Japan a bunch after my trip there last week, but we'll also be looking at all the latest on trade, especially as we head into next week and the expected Trump administration actions. So you can find that at understandingamerica.co. In the meantime, here is David Autor. And Professor David Autor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Please call me David, of course, and it's nice to see you again, Oren.
It is wonderful to see you. We've talked about many things throughout the years, but I think certainly trade policy, its effect on labor markets is an important one. And of course, the China Shock paper is in a sense where it all began. I've always told the story that, I worked for Mitt Romney in 2012, and you could go around the country and notice that something had happened, but economists generally insisted that nothing had yet happened. And it was, I guess, the working paper in 2013, and then ultimately the official date is 2016 on the China Shock paper, was a really sort of seminal moment in people at least noticing something was going on here that needed more study and understanding.
Well, the irony is that a lot of people knew it, but economists didn't know it. And somehow economists had a kind of a mind control field over a lot of politics in sort of saying, if economists said it wasn't happening, then it's probably not happening. And I did, as the work that I've done with Gordon Hanson and David Dorn and many other co-authors since have shown that there really was a very consequential impact of, China's rise, and especially its joining the World Trade Organization, getting permanent normal trade relations with the United States. And that was kind of deeply scarring for directly affected labor markets. That doesn't mean there were no gains or benefits to trade, obviously, but one has to be very cognizant of the distributional consequences. And I think that's something that policymakers and politicians were not very aware of.
I'm curious what got you interested in. To your point about what economists were not looking at, what was the genesis of your work on it at all?
Well, David Dorn and I have been writing papers about technology and regional labor markets. And, it was really actually during a very fortuitous visit out to UC San Diego, where Gordon was at the time. And I've known Gordon for a long time. He's one of the rare people who really straddles trade and labor. And we started talking about the tools that David Dorn and I have been using and this question of China trade. And it was really Gordon who said, hey, we could use the same methodology and look at a different set of forces. And that's what we did. We just said, well, we can look at regional labor markets and we can figure out, which ones are exposed to rising competition from China. And exposure doesn't mean where the products are bought, right? They go to Walmarts all over the country. It means where they would have been produced were they not produced in China. And given that China's merchandise trade deficit with the United States had risen, exports to the U.S. had risen so rapidly, it had to be the case that it was displacing U.S. manufacturing. And so the question really wasn't, will this have effects on manufacturing? It clearly would. But how will people and places adjust to those rapid changes? And there we were quite agnostic. We thought there had to be an effect, but it didn't have to be a bad effect. It had to be a big effect. And so the open question was, do people rapidly, reallocate to other jobs? Do those jobs pay about as well? Do they move across labor markets? In most kind of trade models of the world, there's very few frictions. So, everyone, most trade economists would recognize, look, you have a big reduction in demand for blue collar workers in manufacturing. That's going to have some effect, but in a national labor market of 150 million workers, that's probably not that big a deal because it just lowers wages a tiny little bit and so on. But if the effects stay very local, just to the places where this occurs, it's not just a gradual increase in a tiny increase in inequality, but a big change in the local conditions for workers and what jobs are available, what wages they can earn, then that can have a very big effect. And in labor economics, we tend to think those things have a big effect, actually, because there's a lot of work been going on. More than 30 years ago, the economists Jacobson, Lalonde, and Sullivan, Dan Sullivan, who's now vice president of the Chicago Federal Reserve, sort of showed the scarring effects of just involuntary job displacement, especially for men in kind of heavy industry and in career jobs. They were actually focused on Pennsylvania. And those losses were in the order of 20 to 30 percentage points over 7 to 10 years. So people just did not rebound. So if you asked a trade economist what should you expect, they'd say, well, no friction, people just kind of reallocate. If you asked a labor economist, I think they would have said, well, what we know is involuntary displacement is pretty scarring, so maybe this won't go so smoothly. What we actually found was things did not go smoothly, even to a much greater extent than we even in our kind of least optimistic predictions would have expected.
Right. And so this is an important sort of initial point, is that it is important to note that manufacturing jobs were lost. I mean, there's the sort of classic Ricardian model of trade where everyone specializes in something and maybe some manufacturing jobs go away, but you get other ones instead.
That's right.
I don't think there were a lot of people, even just looking at to your point about the deficits that were emerging, who thought we were creating manufacturing jobs as fast as we were losing them.
It couldn't be. And that's because if you have a huge merchandise trade deficit, that means you're effectively borrowing goods produced elsewhere in place of your own. So if you had deficits are not intrinsically bad or intrinsically good, but it is the case if you all of a sudden start running a very large trade deficit in goods, that if you're going to maintain full employment, you're going to have people move from manufacturing to services. You're just not producing as much stuff because you're importing it from elsewhere. So that's kind of almost an accounting fact. But one, I think, was also sort of lost in the discussion because economists are quick to say, well, deficits are not a bad thing. They're a sign of investment, blah, blah. And that's true. They're not intrinsically a bad thing. But a huge increase in merchandise trade deficit means a lot of reallocation in labor markets. Those things have to go together. And so one did imply the other.
Right. And so the question then was, how smoothly is that happening? And to your point, there was research showing it doesn't necessarily go smoothly. But it sounds like you were still surprised. What made this, do you think, were the results much worse than what had been seen elsewhere? And how much worse?
Yeah, they were much worse. What we found was, I'm trying to think of the right magnitude. So if in the start of 1990, about 12% of the U.S. working age population was employed in manufacturing. Now, it's a larger percentage of workers, but not everyone in the working age population is employed. And, we saw declines, kind of spurred by the trade shock on the order of kind of 1 in 7 or 1 in 6 jobs. So so just to put it in perspective, there was a 22% fall in the number of manufacturing workers in the United States between 1999 and 2007. That is actually quite unprecedented. Not all of that was the China trade shock, but probably a good deal of it was. It just falls off a cliff if you just look at the time series figure of the amount. Manufacturing is 19.9 million jobs in 1979. It's 17.9 million in 1999. So that's a decline of 100,000 per year over 2 decades, and then it falls by 3.7 million jobs in the next 7 years. And so it's startling. So the losses were very large. But then I think that, but is it, how consequential is that? Well, it depends what people did, right? It depends, did they find reemployment, et cetera. And so what the surprise for us was that the manufacturing job loss was essentially 1-for-1 with the total job loss in the areas in which it occurred. We did not see rapid reallocation of people into non-manufacturing. Primarily what we saw was a rise in unemployment and a rise in non-participation, meaning people just not being in the workforce, accompanied by a fall in household incomes and also movement much more into public transfer programs like unemployment and trade-adjusted assistance, but also things that weren't really intended as unemployment programs like disability insurance and even early retirement. So that was very surprising. One thing we didn't find was a lot of mobility, of people moving out of adversely affected places. And that has been a big puzzle. And now our recent work kind of looks at that much, much more carefully. The work that our first China shock paper, which was the first one was published in 2013, and then the kind of overview paper in 2016, really was just using data from 1991 to 2007. But you should think of the China trade relationship with the United States as having kind of 3 periods. The one from kind of 1991 to 2000 is really kind of the onset. And this really reflects primarily developments within China as China is becoming much more productive. They're allowing rural to urban migration. They're adopting Western technologies, foreign direct investment, use of prices, right? Radical changes, but not really reflecting policy of other countries. These were internal reforms, and they were, very healthy for a country that had been in kind of political and economic crisis for decades, right? And China's a vast country with a good education system in many ways. A lot of young people, lots of resources. They're very natural. They would be a big part of the world trade system. The second part really starts at the end of the 1990s. So in 2000, China is given permanent normal trade relations with the United States. In 2001, it joins the World Trade Organization, abetted by the United States. The United States really arranged that. It wouldn't have happened without the U.S. Kind of being the handmaiden to that. And that spurs this incredible surge in Chinese exports. Partly there were reforms in China that actually were brought about by WTO. Joining WTO, it had to change its banking system. It had to reduce its subsidies to state-owned enterprises. Simultaneously, it got reduced tariffs from many other countries to bring in primary materials. And then it faced reduced tariffs selling, so to exports. And so there was just an amazing surge. And then there was probably some currency manipulation on top of that. So that led to just a surge of imports and very rapid rise in the U.S. trade deficit. And that was really, in many ways, what I would think of as the China trade shock that we experienced. Now, that goes on through 2007, 2008. Then we enter the financial crisis. Right. And that's a further huge blow to U.S. manufacturing, but not having to do with China. Right. So by 2011, U.S. manufacturing employment has fallen by 1/3 since 1999. And then since 2011, things have been much closer to a plateau at a very high level. Right. So there hasn't been a further kind of surge of imports. They've increased in dollar terms, but the U.S. economy is larger than it used to be. The nature of what we're importing from China is changing very rapidly. What China is exporting is changing very rapidly, and China's trade relations with the rest of the world is evolving very rapidly. But over the last decade or so in the U.S., it's been comparatively static. And so that gives us a lot more perspective to learn about how people and places have adjusted to what began, more than 2 decades ago at this point.
Yeah, and so this is the new paper then that I was especially interested in. People versus places, I think really digs in on essentially the question of what kinds of jobs are going away, what kinds of jobs are emerging, and who gets them.
Yes.
Because I think one narrative in the mainstream economics community that's been quite prevalent is, well, it doesn't matter if the manufacturing jobs go away. It's even better. It's even a good thing if the manufacturing jobs go away because the jobs that replace them are going to be better jobs. And there are actually two questions here. One, are the jobs better jobs? And two, who gets the better jobs?
Right.
And so...
and I'd add a third question.
Okay, yeah.
Right. Which is, well, maybe this is just a variant of your question, but what happens to the people originally in the manufacturing jobs,
right?
Which I guess would be another way of saying, well, do they get those jobs?
Yes, no, that's right. And so, and the answer to that question is?
Well, yeah. So the answer is once manufacturing goes into decline in these trade exposed areas, there's no rebound, and it continues to plummet. For the next 2 decades. Our data go through 2019, right before the COVID pandemic. There is, starting about 2010, a resurgence of employment growth such that employment in trade-exposed areas grows in net faster between 2000 and 2019 than in less exposed areas. So there's actually, job creation is very robust. Now, the employment rates don't actually rebound that much because there's a lot of people who move in. But there is a lot of job growth. That job growth is primarily in it's going to be like in retail and big box stores. It's going to be in non-traded healthcare, so low-end healthcare, some education, primary education, and then services like food service and restaurants and so on. So it's primarily in what is traditionally low-wage employment. Those are not high-paid sectors. And they're not high. It's not just that they're not high paid because the people in them, have low levels of education or experience. Careful analysis tries to extract what are the pure industry premia, and at this work by David Card and Jesse Rothstein and Moises Yee of the Census Bureau. And it turns out manufacturing industries tend to have these kind of higher wage structures. So when workers move from restaurants to manufacturing, wages go up, and vice versa when they move the other way. And so the jobs that are lost in manufacturing are primarily in kind of the top third and middle third of the national earnings distribution. And the jobs that grow are primarily in the bottom third and somewhat in the middle third and definitely not in the top third of the distribution. So there's a shift towards lower paid jobs. Workers are earning less, and the sectors that they're in tend to be low-paying sectors. So it's really quite a change. But what's particularly interesting about that is, although there is a big decline in manufacturing employment, it is not primarily because lots and lots of manufacturing workers are moving to services. So there's an incredible slowdown of entry of workers into manufacturing. Young people stop entering, people from other commuting zones stop entering, immigrants stop entering. And so a lot of the decline reflects a decline in entry. Mm-hmm. And manufacturing workers, surprisingly, make a relatively low rate of transition to non-manufacturing. Many of them kind of hang on. Some of them leave the labor force, some of them go to non-manufacturing, but a good chunk of them continue to remain in manufacturing at lower wage growth levels. And so a lot of the growth of employment occurs in these service sectors, as I mentioned. And the people who take those jobs are not the original manufacturing workers, as far as we can tell. A very large chunk of them, and let's say that the modal manufacturing worker, right, is a white male, non-college native-born worker. Although women in manufacturing were very heavily affected by the China trade shock, because many of them were in textiles and garments that were, particularly hard hit. There was another change in policy at the end of the multi-fiber agreement. So the job growth is actually among a large chunk among native-born Hispanic Americans, among foreign-born adults who join the U.S. labor force, among women relative to men, among college-educated, and a lot of young people entering, those are, and many of them fit those same demographic characteristics, right? They're native-born Hispanics, they're foreign-born young people, and college-educated women. And so there's an incredible shift in the characteristics of the workforces in those places. But so you have this kind of, you could view this from two perspectives. One perspective would be, look at the dynamism. These places are rebuilding. They were taking different industries. Young people are pouring in. All the diversity and all the dynamism that we expect of the U.S. labor market. And in many ways, these places are recovering. They're different, but they're not wastelands or anything. But the original workers who were in manufacturing are not making those transitions, right? They're much more kind of hanging on with diminished prospects as the workforce changes very rapidly around them. So it's you could tell that same story, the same set of facts from two different perspectives and come to very different conclusions. And I think it's useful to recognize those different perspectives, because you can see how there'd be one group of people who say, look, America is rebuilding itself, look at these places, employment is growing. Another group of people saying, hang on, I didn't do anything, I didn't change anything, and all of a sudden my whole world has, been turned upside down, and I'm still right here. One of the amazing results to us, I mentioned that we didn't see a lot of movement of manufacturing workers to non-manufacturing. We thought, and this is the canonical wisdom, that people would kind of pick up, pull up stakes and move to a better place. We see just the opposite. Out-migration rates of working age adults from trade-exposed commuting zones falls. In-migration rates fall as well. People stop coming and they also stop going. Why? We don't know for sure. One possibility is, look, that's where, that you're in hard times. This is where you need your community. This is where you need your family. Another possibility also is the places you would have gone are also very exposed, right? So there's kind of there's no high ground for you. And so what that means is, although there's this incredible dynamism, the dynamism is not among, native-born whites who populate these manufacturing jobs, among everybody else. So they stop moving out, others stop moving in, and all of the in-migration comes from, young people and foreign-born adults and youth who find and create new opportunity, but in remaking the place in a very distinctive way.
Right. So this raises two questions for me. One, to your point about the in-migration and out-migration, I recall it's a different set of work that you did. I think it was in an AEA presentation on the problem of wages for non-college educated workers, in particular in cities, falling. Yep. So that is that a piece of the story here? To your point that there are the other kind of trade exposed areas where there isn't as much opportunity. It seems like this is also the set of workers who in the past would have seen a lot of upward mobility heading into a city and maybe aren't seeing that as much either.
That's right. There was a time when, cities were considered to be this sort of opportunity escalator. You move to a city, sure, it's a tough place to get started, but, you're on a steeper trajectory and, you can, that's where the opportunity is. That no longer seems to be true. That has really sort of changed dramatically since the early 1990s. I don't think it's because of the China trade shock per se, but it is the case that cities have become much, much more expensive. And the kind of wage differentials have kind of held in place for college-educated workers, but not for non-college workers. And partly that's because cities have much more polarized the kind of relatively high-paid office work, particularly, right, has really, substantially disappeared because of automation, technology, office automation. And so cities are kind of polarized into high-end professionals in, professional, technical, and managerial, and finance, and design, and so on. And then lots and lots of service workers in, food service, and cleaning, and entertainment, recreation, and transportation, and so on. And those are not high-paid jobs. But those are what the non-college workers would tend to do in cities. So inequality has risen in cities in two ways. One is, it's not that the top has kept going, it's the bottom has really fallen out. And simultaneously, the cost of living has risen a great deal. So they really do not offer, as far as we can tell, the kind of escape hatch that they once used to do.
That's exactly then a segue to the second question about job quality, because I took you to be saying two things about what's happening in the trade impacted areas. One is, to your point, some of the manufacturing workers are hanging on with a lower trajectory. Others lose their jobs and might be exiting the workforce altogether. You have a different set of jobs coming in for younger people, immigrants. But it sounded like you were also saying those jobs from a wage structure perspective are, especially for non-college educated workers, not as good as the manufacturing jobs that would have been present before. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, well, without being too value laden, I would say they tend to be lower paid.
Yes,
And
sorry.
they tend to be less
Yeah.
secure as well, because, good thing about manufacturing jobs, they tend to offer regular full-time hours. It's just natural for the rhythm of manufacturing, right? You want to keep the plant going. So you work 8-hour shifts or 60, or 2 shifts or 3 shifts. Whereas the structure of retail and services is much more nights, is weekends, it's intermittent demand, high at lunch, high on Saturday, Sunday, but low in the mid-morning. And so that work tends to be not only paid less per hour, probably because it's less specialized, right? It doesn't require specialized expertise. Most people can, many people can do it. But also it offers less of the kind of consistency that is especially useful. Many low-paid workers are not just have low wages, they're very hours constrained. Employers don't want to hire full-time because they run into a kind of a big benefits cliff when they do. And also they don't need workers on those kind of regular schedules. They need them for, short shifts, 4, 6, 8 hours, the so-called clopening. You close the restaurant, then you reopen it within 11 hours, same person. So those irregular schedules are a major disamenity, and the economists have worked very carefully to show that workers would really pay a lot to not have that. I think they're less. So there tend to be lower earnings and have other less of these desirable characteristics, and they're also, for better or for worse, and this is really not something that that economics has that much to say about it, but they're often lower status as well. Mm-hmm. And many of them are in sectors that traditionally have employed relatively more women than men, opposite of manufacturing. So there's a big, of the, we find over the, I don't want to be too dweeby technical here, but over, the 20-year period, places that are kind of one standard deviation more exposed, so kind of more than 2/3 of other places, they see a net increase in labor in employment of about 1.5 percentage points. No, about 2 percentage points, and 2/3 of that is coming from women. So the ratio of male to female workers falls, especially outside of manufacturing. And so women are much more likely to enter the hospitality sectors. They're much more likely to enter the healthcare and education sectors. And so it's a big change in the structure of work as well. And I think that is, from the perspective of many men, I suspect that would not be viewed as a positive.
Right. Well, and you did, one of your follow-on papers also looked at that dynamic with respect to the impacts on marriage, right? And it was very asymmetric. Is that right?
Yeah. So we find that, essentially the things that kind of cause male wages to fall relative to women's wages, or the, potential earnings, tend to reduce marriage, reduce fertility, increase the likelihood that children are living in households below the poverty line, and also increase, what some economists call deaths of despair, right? Deaths among, working age adults from drugs and alcohol and suicide. So yeah, we do find, not surprisingly, right, that there are other social manifestations of these costs, right? The way I think about it, and I suspect you might agree with me on this, Oren, the labor market is really, I think, the central organizing institution of a free market economy, right? It provides earnings, but it provides structure of activity, friendships, esteem, identity, purpose, and so it anchors many things together. I also think it provides political voice, by the way, and people being able to say, "Look, I'm a contributor to this society. I deserve a vote. I deserve, et cetera." And so I think when the labor market, turns down in a very dramatic way, and especially for a subset of people, a lot of other social institutions come under a great deal of pressure. And I think we see that very clearly.
Yeah, and so I guess the last question that raises then for me on the China shock research is, it goes back to something you said earlier about sort of deficits aren't necessarily good or bad.
Right.
And listeners of this podcast know I am obsessed with deficits as very bad. And the case that I would make is that essentially what all of this research seems to say, even putting the shock element aside, is that from a sort of labor market structure perspective, in fact, all jobs are not equal, and manufacturing goods for the merchandise trade are better than the jobs that replace them. And is that in fact a fair thing to say? And if so, then doesn't that mean that the deficits are in fact quite harmful?
So let me take that in two parts. There is a long debate about sort of, are we fetishizing manufacturing jobs and so on. Manufacturing jobs are often very physically demanding. They can be dangerous. Not everyone seems to want them nowadays, right? There's a lot of openings in manufacturing that are proving very hard to fill. So people's norms about what they want have changed. I think the evidence makes pretty clear that they do tend to pay relatively higher wages to people without, especially to people without college degrees, and they do tend to offer more stable schedules and hours. And I think that's actually quite a big deal. Even if you said, well, they earn, they make 20% more, but 10% of that is because they work more hours, I would say, well, that's good. The deficit thing, it's a lot of it is the change in the deficit at this point, right? So in other words, with our current deficit, we have less manufacturing than we would and more services than we would. If the deficit were to shrink, we would have to produce a lot more stuff to export, right? Or those would be this kind of two sides of the same coin. So then we would have more manufacturing and less services. But even if you said, okay, the deficit is what it is, all of a sudden a sharp increase in that deficit would, if it were in goods, would again have this effect, right? Would cause further dislocation. So I do think even if you are someone who, says, well, in steady state, the deficit's not that big a deal, it's fine. Big changes in that are going to move things around a lot. And I think that was really underappreciated in this discussion and something that we really came to appreciate in our research. If we'd had the same, quote, China shock, but we had exported as much as we imported, we would have had to move a lot of workers across different areas of manufacturing. But we wouldn't have had to move as many workers out of manufacturing. Now, I don't know that those same workers would have moved, right? Because the manufacturing that we lost really was labor intensive, relatively low education, relatively non-specialized manufacturing, making, leather products, commodity furniture, assembly, low-end tools, building materials, and the manufacturing that we would have had to expand, if we did expand, would have been automotive, aircraft, machine tools, and so on. So it would have been a different group of workers typically, and often in different parts of the country, right? The China shock exposed regions were in the South Atlantic and the Deep South, and that's not an accident. Those same sectors, the textiles and leathers and so on, they used to be up in the Northeast. Those were high-tech sectors. And as they faced greater competition, they moved to the lower wage parts of the United States and to less educated where they could be done more cheaply. And so the kind of high-end manufacturing is not typically done in those places. Oh, that's changing too. So it wouldn't have been easy, even if we'd had no increase in trade deficit, for that expansion to occur and have the same set of people move from one set of jobs to the other.
Yeah, and so and that to some extent then, to your point about rate of change more so than existence of change, was also something that was fairly unique, it seems to me, about the China shock relative to virtually any other either trade or technology shock that we might have seen.
And that's something I really want to emphasize. Actually, 2 points I want to emphasize. One is in labor markets, the kind of, tear the Band-Aid off, get it over with view is totally not appropriate. Labor markets have a natural ebb and flow, right? When a sector declines, people retire and young people don't enter. And so it's quite possible for a large change to occur in a sector without many people losing their jobs, because there's maybe 5% or 10% of people turn over a year. So over the course of 5 or 10 to 20 years, you could replace everybody and fire no one, or close it all down. So something that happens in 7 years as opposed to 20 years, the same thing, causes much more pain. And I don't just mean more concentrated pain, I mean just much more pain, because you can't handle it through natural attrition, right? If Doge says we're going to shrink the federal government by not hiring anyone, well, that would eventually shrink the federal government, but no one would be fired. If they say we're going to shrink the federal government by firing 20% of people, 20% of people are going to lose their jobs. And that's part of what made the China shock so consequential, impactful, was that it happened so quickly. The other thing I want to say is, do we know, I think it's reasonable to ask, do we know anything that, helps in these situations? The U.S. was not prepared. Our trade adjustment system is small, difficult to access, and mostly provide extended training. There was a kind of a policy experiment done during the Obama administration called wage insurance. And the way this worked is, if let's say you were making $20 an hour in a trade, in manufacturing, and then you got displaced because of trade, and you could demonstrate that to the TAA, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Authority, and let's say instead you got a $10 an hour job. Well, the wage insurance would make up half of that difference for up to 2 years, for up to $10,500 over 2 years. And so, part of the difficulty of adjusting to a shock like that is the notion of like, look, I'm a $20 an hour person. I'm not taking a $10 an hour job. What do you think I am? Or who do you think I am? And trade adjustment assistance, the wage insurance, was actually incredibly effective at getting people to take employment again. It more than fully paid it for itself multiple times over, just in increased tax revenue and decreased unemployment insurance, and even more so when you count the people who didn't go on disability. Now, it was not a panacea. It didn't get people back into high-wage jobs. It just got them working faster. So, on the other hand, there's no more scalable program in the world than money, and that's what this was. Even that, kind of rudimentary effort would have, if we'd done it, could have been very, very helpful. So I think, we ought to think about, we're going to face other shocks, right? Trade is not the only one of them. It's just one we get to vote on. Many of the shocks that we face, we don't get to vote on, technology being one of them. And so we should be thinking hard, because change happens, and sometimes very fast. And we need to, as a society, enable people to make those transitions. Often we are kind of collectively beneficiaries of change, right? Technology may make us productive. More productive trade may make us, give us lower prices, but the costs are often borne by a very concentrated subset of people. And there's in my opinion, no reason why we shouldn't be making every effort to, compensate them or at least assist them. Not that I want to say losing your job and getting a government check is not full compensation, right? Let's be clear. People care about their identity, they care about their jobs, they care about the notion that they're working and earning a living. So I'm not saying these things are commensurate. They're not. But nevertheless, all else equal, you'd still rather have the money.
Yes. And to your point about the wage insurance, it also helps you move back into another job, even if it isn't the same kind.
That's right. I think and there's a recent work by Ben Hyman and Brian Kovac, and I think it's Dan Levy. I'm not sure of his first name. Yeah.
All right. Well, want to quickly touch on automation before we wrap up, both because it's floating in the background of the China shock conversation, and then of course it is looking ahead, something that a lot of people are thinking about.
Yeah.
In the historical context, it has always frustrated me when people say, yes, the China shock is going on, but of course, most of what was happening was automation. And the reason for that is it seems to me that the rate at which we've seen automation, particularly measured as productivity growth, has always been fairly steady. And so to your point about at a certain rate of change, all you're really doing is accommodating people in retiring in a sense. And had you sort of envisioned a base case of just continued automation, you probably would have seen virtually no downside at all. You would have seen what we saw in earlier periods, which was rising productivity, higher wages, higher output. And the China shock is sort of the trade impact in that respect is a completely different animal from what automation had been doing and then perhaps continued to do. Do you think, is that a fair distinction, or do you think automation changed also?
I think there's important distinctions, but automation is also not a free lunch. It also dislocates people. So like people are often, deriding the Luddites, right, who rose up against the power looms in, Victorian England, but their livelihoods were wiped out by automation, and the whole artisanal class was, kind of destroyed, and it took 6 decades for wages to start rising again when, Britain entered the Second Industrial Revolution. So I think the things that have made technology somewhat different over the last 100 years, one is it is generally slower moving. It doesn't happen overnight. Two is it doesn't have the kind of regional concentration, right? So, where the trade shock occurred, right? There was a place in Martinsville, Virginia called the sweatshirt capital of the world, right? And it's no longer a sweatshirt capital. More than 40% of its workers were in manufacturing. Now it's on the order of, I think, 15 or 17%. And so and those industries, they're kind of the anchor sectors of the places where they're located, and they go out all at once. So, you and I in the place we grew up probably weren't making sweatshirts. It was not, we didn't feel it. So when we have automation, we've lost millions of clerical workers, right, over the last 30 or 40 years, but there was never a clerical capital of the United States, right, that was wiped out, right? These are roles that you would find in many, many industries, in sectors, in places all over the country. So although the effect is quite significant, it's much more, sorry, I apologize. I just saw an email go by this way. Though it's quite large, it doesn't have the regional concentration. And then a third point is that from the perspective of consumers and workers, a trade shock looks like lower prices, but also less demand, and it will put businesses and industries out of business. Whereas a technology shock will generally look like more demand. It'll be perceived as higher productivity, at least by employers and firms. And so, although they both are effectively changing the cost of goods and services, they work in really different ways. And so, I think the automation tends to be perceived quite differently because it has a more obvious upside. Now, trade also has an obvious upside, but not from the business perspective generally.
Right. And so I guess I would be remiss then if I didn't conclude by asking about AI. We need like an air horn or something that goes off every time AI comes up. But here it's actually relevant. I don't know if this makes me an optimist or pessimist, but I am a believer that AI will generally be of the kind of technological change that we have experienced in the past, a new general purpose technology, but one that takes a long time to phase in and probably on balance at least can be beneficial if you have the right labor market structures. Other people think the world will end sometime in the next couple of years. What is your view on it?
Well, if the world ends in the next couple of years, it won't be because of what AI did to the labor market, right? So I think these are I actually think the threats to AI from AI are quite significant, but they're mostly not the labor market threats, right? There's existential risk, there's disinformation, there's malicious activity, there's weaponization, all kinds of terrible things can be done with AI. And it's not that AI will do those things to us. We will use AI to do that to one another. Right. Do it. I think the labor market risks, are basically devaluation of expertise, right? Knowledge that makes people specialize and makes their work valuable. And then if it's all of a sudden becomes too cheap to meter, right? Even though it's great for consumers, it's bad for the workers who have that knowledge, right? So if all of a sudden you make your living just writing code, you don't know much about software engineering, you might face a lot more competition, right, from Copilot and things like that. Now, if you're a software engineer, you'd say, oh my God, this saves me all kinds of time. But if you're a coder, that's not going to necessarily look good. I think AI has potential to raise productivity a lot. And more than just raise productivity, to sort of open new vistas of things that we can do in medicine, in education, in energy generation, in more efficient farming, in poverty alleviation. So I think it creates incredible opportunity. There will definitely be occupations that are displaced, and some of them quite rapidly. I think if I were a translator, language translator, I'd be very, very uncomfortable right now. If I were doing, graphical illustration, I would be extremely worried about the way my IP is being used by AI. And And I think for certain, some managerial occupations, we could see risks. And so I don't want to say that those are not present. I do not think it's going to be an employment apocalypse. We have a lot of demographic pressure in the labor market of actually having too few working age adults. Now, that reflects both our low birth rates and also very restrictive immigration policy, getting more restrictive. And so we're in a period of scarcity, and most of the industrialized world is, right? I mean, Asia has much, much lower, birth rates than we do, and most of Europe has much lower birth rates than we do. So I think we're going to face change, and it's going to be mixed. There's going to be productivity growth, but there will be, just like with trade, there will be people who are displaced, and there will be new jobs created. And generally, the people who are getting the new jobs will not be the ones who are displaced from the old jobs. So I think we have to pay very close attention and think about how we help people adjust. I do not think it will look like the China shock, because I don't think it will move as fast. I don't think it will be as regionally concentrated. And I think it will be perceived by businesses as a productivity gain rather than an existential threat to their business model. But I think we also should be humble about, there's a lot of uncertainty. Right. Anyone who tells you they know with certainty what's about to happen is someone you should not take very seriously, because there's just no certainty to be had. So my view is that, we should simultaneously be optimistic and pessimistic. We should recognize that there's great opportunity, but that some bad stuff is going to come to pass, and there's no way that it's going to be Pareto improving where everyone benefits. That just will not happen. There will be, significant concentrated loss of, some jobs, some occupations, some valuable skills will all of a sudden no longer be valuable. And, but if there's upside, if there are gains, we should be working to at least provide the social insurance, the transition mechanism that, again, doesn't make people whole. It doesn't make them like, oh, I don't care. They gave me a check. I'm fine losing my job, but it's better than the alternative. And so, I hope and if there's one lesson we can learn from the China shock, is we should be paying very, very close attention to that.
Yes, well, I was exactly going to say, and thanks to your work, we are paying much closer to attention, and I think economists are a lot more aware of some of the things that are likely to happen along the way. So, David Autor, thank you so much for your time and your research, and sharing it all with us today.
Thanks very much for inviting me on the podcast, and I'm really valuable to have this conversation, and it's a pleasure to speak with you again, Oren.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.